I wish we could see all of you out there. That's the one downfall here.
Well, I'm going to just start off with a quick intro for myself, for the class. Obviously, I'm very fortunate to be doing this class today in the seminar with Lynnette Marrero and Newman. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this, for putting the time into the slides and to talk about cocktails today. My name is Daniel Warlow. I work for Campari America. I work on the Italian portfolio, so I cover about 7 brands. Obviously, Campari as a company, the namesake of the company, is one of our favorite brands and one of the original red Italian bitter, or the original red Italian bitter that's out there. Campari's been around 160 years this year, so since 1860. We're based in Milan. You may have heard of one of our cocktails called the Negroni, which is really, really great. We're going to talk about that today. And we're going to talk about equal parts cocktails in general. So in order to do that, I'm going to pass it off. I'm going to start with Kara. I'll let you just give a little intro and kick us off in the class, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I am the author of a book called Shake, Stir, Sip, and it's all about equal parts cocktails. And Lynnette is featured in the book. Negronis are featured prominently throughout the book, even on the cover. And that's completely by accident, happy accident. And to tell you a bit about how this all started, I originally started researching the book as an article for wine enthusiasts. And I was amazed that there were so many equal parts drinks out there. Some were classics like the Negroni, some were bartender originals that really become new classics like the Paper Plane. And it just evolved into a book. It just grew and grew because there are so many. And there have been so many more since the book was published in 2016. I keep thinking, well, maybe it's time for a sequel. Who knows? Maybe my publisher's watching. Who knows? And it's interesting how popular many of the drinks are, and how popular the equal parts construct is. And by that, I just mean that they are drinks made with ingredients in precisely equal proportion. And it's interesting because it doesn't mean that the drinks themselves are dumbed down. They can actually be very complex. They seem to be really incredibly difficult to create. But when they work, they're magical. It's incredible. It seems like it's very difficult to find the right balance to create an equal parts drink too. I mean, trust me, I've tried. I've poured many, many of them down the drain. They're really difficult to make. But when they work, like I said, they're just really mind-blowing. And along the way, a lot of bartenders have told me that they use ratio-based cocktails, like a 1-to-1 50-50 Martini, or a 1-1-1 a Negroni. A lot of bartenders have told me they use ratio-based cocktails as teaching tools because they are all about ratios, kind of similar to cooking. I mean, I think also of sauces or pound cakes as being similar ratio-based recipes. I mean, a pound cake, it's 1 part each: flour, sugar, butter, eggs. It's the same thing for drinks. It's 1 part, 1 part, 1 part, if you're thinking of a Negroni. And I think they also have been so popular because they're useful for batching, although they're certainly not foolproof. I've found that bitters, for example, it can be hard to find the right ratio to put into equal parts drinks. Consumers love them because they're easy formulas to remember, and of course, because they're impossible to screw up. And pros seem to really love them because often they're the basis for many cocktail families. And most importantly, they're useful templates. They can be a great foundation for riffing and making a drink your own. And that's why I'm just completely fascinated by this genre of cocktails. And with that, I'll hand it over to Lynnette.
Absolutely. So we first kind of ventured down this path, as Kara said, in 2016. She, myself, and Joaquin Simo from Pouring Ribbons did a presentation at Star Chefs about this topic. And what's funny is I didn't realize how much at that point equal parts were going to have such a importance in my repertoire and things I was doing. And I think, especially because I've moved so much into restaurant bars, I think equal parts cocktails make so much sense in that space of pairing with food, because they tend to be extremely ingredient driven. Like the Negroni, can use a lot of amari and things that are great pairings with food, but they're just delicious. And also, you know, when you were first learning, they're the ones you can't forget. You're like, oh, I'm so happy it's just a corpse reviver. I can do this one now. And you try to remember all these complexities. But what I've really loved revisiting this topic is that there's so many more ingredients now. Even just the Italian portfolio with Campari has grown, and there's so many different ways you can like think about equal parts. And so that's what we're going to kind of discover here is just a little bit of like the classics, the family trees, where they come from, and then talk a little bit more where like people have just like innovated on something that seems so simple. And that's what I love. It's kind of like going back to our basics. I think at the simplest, and I think what I've loved about watching a lot of these classes is that sometimes, you know, going back to what you thought you like, oh, I have that under my belt, and revisiting it and reworking it helps fine tune your craft a bit more. So let's start with the next slide and talk about where equal parts comes from. Like, what is this building block? Where does it come from? We'll click to the next slide. We'll thank our lovely sponsor. That's our pretty, like, everyone, I really love putting together presentations because you can get pretty pictures. So next slide, Leo. We'll click through. Great. So equal parts, we're good. Thanks, Campari. These are how you can get a hold of us. Thank you to PDXCW for this online learning. And let's go. All right, we did that slide. And all right, Mr. Potato Head, here we go. So we all know Mr. Potato Head. It's like, I love that this is the simplest way to explain to everyone what we do for a living. You know, people really get it. I'm like, you get it. You know, it's like Mr. Potato Head, right? You put all these different things together, and now he's a person. And he's got his thing going on. But if I take off his nose and put a different nose, he's a whole different person. You can click, first click. So how to do it, right? So Mr. Potato Head technique is just changing either the base spirit, we can change the modifier, other liqueurs, change the sugars and sweeteners. There's so many different ways. If it's an equal parts cocktail that has citrus, changing the citrus, changing all the other mixers. So this is basically what we're doing, looking at a template, looking at something that works, and then pulling out the one ingredient and putting something else in that style, or elevating it. And I think we've done a really, like, this is bartender's wheelhouse, right? We all know something has always been creative, but we can take a dealer's, you know, take a cocktail, play around with it, and bring, you know, we can click on this, bring in our Mr. Potato Head's variations on him. Like, you can make these superstar awesome drinks out of that goofy Mr. Potato Head. And then harmoniously click, you have this cocktail that is new, that is different, that people haven't had. But it's also a great blank slate, a way that you're able to think about, you know, putting ingredients together. And I think that's sometimes, like, I think we've gone so far sometimes in creativity and feeling that we have to like molecular change everything, that sometimes going back to basics and what's simplest is actually a really great tool. So we'll go to the next slide and just go through a few of just kind of the super classics family tree. I love that we were like, it's the super classics. And this is our super trippy, awesome.
So trippy.
How our bartender brains work, right? So we have all these different branches, all these different arms of where cocktails come from. And this is what Kara said, like, chefs learn the basic sauces. They know a mirepoix, all those different things that build flavors. That's in your arsenal. And then that trickiness of how to take a classic, something that's so simple and ingrained, and making that different and unique is really actually, I think, one of the best challenges out there for all of us, to rethink how we do things that seem at first super easy. So we're going to tackle the godfather of all equal parts drinks, the Negroni. We'll touch on the Martini, which I know we're like, oh, that's not always equal parts. We're going to really talk about the 50-50 when we talk about that. And then I wanted to get into this world of where we all love playing around with these like low proof and things that are sherry based. So like the bamboo actually becomes a really interesting place for innovation on when we're going with those types of equal parts cocktails. And then shaken, like the two that really stand out are the Last Word and the Corpse Reviver, which have spawned so many variations that have become famous in their own right. So it's really crazy when you think about just from these, 5 cocktails, we could all write like 7 menus that would be different, unique, and interesting. So that for me is what's really exciting when we get to it. So we're going to move on to the next slide and start with stirred, and next slide to Count Negroni. So again, click on this really quick because we have our Negroni and our Negroni family. So these are the cocktails that come from this world. The Milano Torino, which we'll cover in just a moment. The Americano, obviously, which is taking out the gin and having soda water. So you have Campari and sweet vermouth and soda. The Negroni, and then the Sbagliato, where you're elevating up with some bubbles. And these cocktails, what I love is that they have a history, they have a family and a way to go, and they've spawned, like just from this Negroni, click ahead, all these other cocktails, the Boulevardier, the Old Pal, the Kingston Negroni, which I'm set up to make here. You know, I've made several variations on this cocktail that I've done, where just changing the mezcal or pisco, or, you know, using sherry instead of sweet vermouth, and then changing rum instead of gin. So there's lots of different ways that you innovate on these cocktails. You know, the Trident there is one of the really good examples from Robert Hess, where he used dry sherry and Cynar and aquavit to create a new cocktail based on the equal parts template here. So that's a kind of pulls you out in a whole different way. You're like, wow, now we're adding, like, you know, instead of sweet vermouth, we're putting an artichoke, and then you're adding the caraway from the aquavit, and what a different flavor combination. And then instead of dry vermouth, using dry sherry. So knowing that all these drinks are related and are in a family is really useful to just start looking. And when you start identifying those drinks, you're like, oh, right, that makes sense. All right, next slide. All right, so the Milano Torino. All right, so Daniel Borrello has done all the research. The good thing is, like, when you Google around, all these times and dates are a little bit loosey-goosey because the official Camparino wasn't actually there at the time. But these cocktails are still credited to Gaspare Campari because he was creating drinks, which I think is also really cool, that he actually created drinks that were out and about in the world, and that people were enjoying. It's not, you don't always get that from someone who's also creating things, the spirits that we play with. But the Milano Torino is the first cocktail that we see that starts in this world of the Negroni, and kind of is this lovely precursor. So the ingredients are Campari, sweet vermouth, equal parts, simple, delicious, right? So it makes sense. Really think about the kind of things people were consuming at the time, the wines from the region, and especially this part of Italy, and I'll let Daniel just jump in whenever he wants, about what kind of wines were there and what they were playing with. But also tonics and things with bitters were always associated with digestivos and after a big meal. So these cocktails really make sense in that sort of context. Daniel, do you have any other big tips about Gaspare at this time and the Negroni in general? Because I know we've got lots of things to talk about with Negronis. The event that normally happens in the summer, however, pandemic pushed it back. So if we can kind of get into a little bit of the Negroni and these Italian spirits with you, that'd be great, just to kind of have a context for working with them.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess if we want to just take a step back, I mean, Gaspare was a very interesting kind of creator. He spent most of his life working in bars and restaurants, obviously up until his passing. So roughly about 50 years of, because he started when he was 14, of course, about 50 years of, innovating, working in this field, creating, obviously he moved all over northern Italy, but spent most of his life in Milan, obviously, where we have the Camparino bar and where we're based globally. But at the time when he moved to Milan, the space which the Camparino is in right now, which is in the Galleria, there was no Galleria there. It was just the Duomo, and then there were buildings. And he and his family moved there. He opened Cafe Campari, which is kind of a precursor to the Camparino. And in that space, before they built the Galleria, is where he started working on this product and actually making this a thing for people to try. And then it wasn't until the city came in and they said, hey, by the way, we're going to demolish all these buildings. We're going to build this massive Galleria. Do you want a space in here when it's back up? And he was like, yeah, of course I want a space. I want 2 spaces, actually. So when you go to the Galleria now and you go to where the Camparino is, it has this beautiful position looking right at the Duomo, right on the corner, and across the hallway from it, there's actually a cafe there now, which he also used to occupy. And above that space is where his son Davide was born. So Davide Campari, whose name is on the bottle, was actually the first citizen in Milan to be born in the Galleria, which is a really interesting time frame. But those two were so innovative in so many different ways. They were the first people to put a soda gun into their space. They obviously created this product in the basement of the Camparino, and it wasn't until Gaspari's passing that they actually built a really huge facility to make this out of. It was all done in the basement. But the really interesting thing about Campari is that as a product, talking about equal parts, it's always about balancing things out. And obviously, the Milano Trino is a good example of a two-part, equal part cocktail. But we also have a cocktail called the Shakerado, which is just Campari shaken. And it's a really interesting thing how you can use even just one product. And because of its texture, the bitterness, the balance of sweet, and all of those things, you can give it different textures by manipulating it in a different way, and still just use that one thing. So that's an interesting first start. And then obviously moving on to the other editions of the Negroni or of the Milano Trino, and then Americano and Spagliato, and we'll get to those. They're all just a slight build with different things that are better or worse depending on what you like. So some people are going to be into bubbly, sparkling cocktails, or want something a little bit less bitter. So you might want something like an Americano. You're going to move into something that's a little bit heftier in booze, and people are going to want that classic Negroni style or whatever it may be. But I think the cool part about equal parts in general, especially working with some of these Italian aperitivi digestivi, is that they all offer something different for each person. And like you said, the Mr. Potato Head thing, each person can decide. It's like choose your own adventure when you were a kid. You get to choose which path you go down. And so it's actually kind of like a fun game for adults to play. We don't I kind of feel like we're all very large children, but this is the epitome of it. We really get to have fun with it. So that's one of my favorite things for sure.
Yeah, and what's the deal with Negroni Week? Do we have any announcements on that?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, so
this is your R&D session, everyone. We're going to read Negroni, talk about Negroni Week, so then you can think about some of these things when you're thinking about what you want to put on the menu.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so Negroni Week, normally the first week in June. We moved that this year with our partners at Imbibe to the 14th of September, so that week. Obviously, everything is going to be going all digital this year. Everything's going to be virtual. We're going to have a lot of content every single day like we normally do during Negroni Week. But there's some really, really important parts to Negroni Week this year that I'd like to share. So obviously, everybody that's working in food and beverage and hospitality in general knows what's happening with our industry. Our industry is probably the hardest hit of any industry that's out there. 1 in 4 unemployed Americans work in the hospitality field, and that there doesn't seem to be a clear plan of action. So as a company, obviously, we work with people in hospitality. That's what we do. That's why we are here. And that's why I have my job. So a large part of our focus is to try to help the industry as much as possible. So while normally during Negroni Week, it's all about whatever charity you would like. I always, make reference to, if you like puppies, you could have a puppy charity. If you like, supplying food to some parts of the country that maybe don't have access to it, or whatever it may be. We always say you can choose what you want. This year, it's all about the industry, and it's all about hospitality. So all of the charities that we're working with are to benefit our industry and to benefit hospitality in general. The money that we normally donate every year, we are donating specifically to that industry. And we're trying to come up with new ways and fun, interactive ways for consumers to also engage and benefit our industry. So while normally they may go to a bar and buy a Negroni, which they can't do this year, they could do something online or be engaged with someone in our industry online to do that. So we're really trying to draw attention to that. And I think it's something that as a group of people, we have the ability to do that and the power to do that. And what's the best way to do it than bring cocktails and stories to people that we normally do, but in a different way. So thank you for bringing that up, Lynnette. Really appreciate that.
Cool. All right. I'm sorry, my Wi-Fi dropped for a second. All right, so we're going to go back to the slides. That was awesome. I'm excited to see what's going to go on. So Negroni, this is the most beautiful version of Negroni, styled by Simo. I love this. But again, think about the Negroni, just even so, where we all seem to innovate on it, and I know that out there, we're not all traditionalists on the equal parts. A lot of us were more gin, and I don't know if that was the gin people just telling us all to ask for more gin. But that's pretty much how I was taught the Negroni. However, I have been rediscovering the Negroni in equal parts during this time, and have found how awesome it can be, especially if you stick with the equal parts and you change out the gins. It's a really cool experiment to see how this drink changes by just changing the one ingredient, not changing the parts. Obviously with vermouths too. So we'll get into a little bit later too about equal parts with equal parts. A lot of us in our house vermouths will like split Cinzano with Punta Mez. We want a little more bitter. Like, how does that change a Negroni? Whereas like here, in my pandemic house, I'm like, I just got Cinzano. I don't have any Punta Mez. I'm rediscovering what that tastes like when it's like that. So, it all comes down to, like, at the end of the day, the ingredients and understanding the ingredients and thinking of how you shift and change that one ingredient, that we have here too. We can change our spirit, we're changing our sweet vermouths, and that beautiful range that we now have access to of all those different flavors of a dark Italian vermouth style. So I would say that not even like just putting in traditional vermouths, but there's so many different beautiful Amari that work in a vermouth-like way. So next slide. So we are going to talk a little bit in depth about, so here's the basic structure, right? This is our Campari. I actually really love this. So we have our gin, Campari, and our sweet vermouth. So if we click here, we'll see kind of all the different ways you can change this, right? So I'm going to change my gin to bourbon or rye. That now makes it a Boulevardier. We'll click again. If I add aged rum, I end up with a Kingston Negroni. If I use tequila and mezcal and pisco and all these other things, they are all new cocktails based on the Negroni. And they bring different things. And then here's the whole range of other things you can change. You can use Canatos instead of sweet vermouth, Cynar instead of sweet vermouth, Sherry instead of sweet vermouth. Change your sweet vermouth to a Bianco, to a dry. So there's lots of different ways to play there. Work with Fino Sherry, all these different things you can do. Sherry in its own has, again, all those kind of ranges, Punta Mez, Lillet even. So we're playing around with just those two different components, and we can have endless drinks and endless variations that go on our menus that can go ahead and change things. One of the interesting things that, some of the cocktails I like to talk about here is kind of like the banana Boulevardier, which Kara brought to my attention from Anvil, where Alex there was taking, it's like one bourbon, one sweet vermouth, but then half banana liqueur, half Campari. And then and then it has an orange twist. Like that alone just like was like, whoa, now I'm taking out some of the bitterness. I'm adding this like tropical fruit note. Like now I'm like, well, what if we took out the bourbon and whiskey and I put Appleton, and now I'm in like tropical banana rum Negroni mode. I'm super stoked about it. Like, that sounds really good. I have to see if I have like any of those little cheater balls of banana liqueur around to try and make. But thinking again, like how simple that like one change makes a cocktail. And then we haven't gone with like the twist, right? Then do you change the twist when you're adding things like maybe it's a grapefruit twist, maybe it's an orange twist, maybe it's a lemon twist, like all these other different elements that you're going to change on that drink that create different ingredients and that create this different aroma and this different, my mind goes to like so much about how changing those little simple things change what dish I'm serving with it. Like one of my favorite things to serve Negronis with is charcuterie plates. Makes sense. But you think about how you would change your cheese selection based on, what spirit you're using, right? So if I'm using tequila, which is a bit higher acid, I'm maybe thinking about pairing my tequila Negroni with maybe some cheeses that can use acid, really creamy ones that want that. But if I'm going with my Boulevardier style, I might want to really load that cheese plate with cured meats that maybe have some sort of nuts in them, or add almonds or things like that I think go with like some of those spice notes from bourbon and rye. So there's just so many different ways of thinking about your equal parts drink and how it completes the guest experience. And I think this is why I'm obsessed with them, especially working in restaurants, because my challenge is to create cocktails that go with dishes and that people are enjoying throughout the meal. And this is a really awesome way, especially when we're talking about acid as well. So adding acidity by changing maybe like what our vermouth source is, or what that element is, will also help us play with creating new cocktails in this style. So I think that this is, to me, kind of like the coup d'etat, you know, like you have like the I'm like, I can take this drink and completely smash it down and rebuild it, and it's still awesome. It's like stands the test of time. So no matter how you innovate around it, right? So, and then you can come up with an entirely new set of drinks that are inspired by the Negroni, but aren't Negronis. So like the Contessa, which is Aperol and gin, you know, that is no longer a Negroni, but it's inspired by the Negroni, and with dry vermouth, but it's completely another whole different kind of cocktail. And like the Tavi cocktail, which I put in Kara's book, is aged rum and sherry and Aperol. So there's ways that you can kind of look at these drinks, and then it can have a whole new category of drinks. And we'll see that with some of the other topics and which styles that then they become their own new subset that were distant relatives to this one base drink, but just the Negroni itself has so many different ways to innovate around it, around Campari. And then when you go down a different path, you have a whole new set of drinks. We can go to the next slide. So what I love about this is like, this is a beautiful, just like visual representation of all kind of equal parts in their intersection. And I love that they all really start towards Negroni, but then, you know, we do get to some of these things like a bijou, which is, you know, no longer a Negroni because it has no Campari, but it became its own thing that thought about the template of how you're using, you know, a liqueur that brings all this flavor to it. So this is going with sweet vermouth and gin and chartreuse. So changing the whole style. Now you're going in a more herbal style and not going in this bitter digestiva way or aperitivo way, but having a whole different style of drink. The same thing with the Contessa, where they're like the outliers, but everything that surrounds the Negroni right there, you have endless opportunities to change that drink. Like I think Karen and I noted, like we're talking about, like there's so many more circles that could be added to the left side, building off of Campari, that we now have that makes this whole chart like not even like see the full potential anymore. And then like a whole new group of families, just even like building off Aperol, and now has its own like world of people that it can like build off and have its own drinks. But this is just a really great view and context for putting together these style of drinks. Next slide. All right. Do you guys have anything else to contribute to Negroni, Kara or Daniel, before we move past Negroni?
I did see one other really interesting variation. You've mentioned the banana Vardier. There's an interesting version that came out of a small operation called the Covert Cocktail Club. He actually used pineapples and infused the Campari with pineapple. So there was a flavor component, a nuanced flavor component added, but then he also had these pink-hued triangles to garnish the drink, and it was a really fun play on it, I thought.
That's awesome. No, and that's actually a really good point. Like, you know, how to kind of not be restrained by your equal parts. One way that you can do that is by infusing. I think Alex Day, was the first person I saw who cacao infused Campari. So again, like taking those cocoa nibs, putting them into Campari, elevating that like bitterness with chocolate, and then adding that to cocktails. Again, you can keep your equal parts by just changing some of those things. And there's other ways you can use, like, you know, a herb infused, like basil infused Blanc vermouth, and put it with Campari and gin would be delicious, you know. So again, lots of other ways to stick to your equal parts by manipulating another ingredient. And that's just kind of a way to go forward with, like, also having another dynamic way of shifting those. And again, still making them easy drinks. So you're just doing a little bit of prep on your side to innovate on them.
I think also, Lynnette, one of the things that I've learned in my evolution of learning the Negroni and other parts of the Negroni is that you really start to understand what each component brings to the table. And that's when I started to learn so many things about subcategories of aromatized and fortified wines based on what they're made up of, what their botanical mix is. And then also thinking about sweetness levels and thinking about spice and alcohol levels, and is it wine based versus spirit based? I think there's so many things to think about, not just in the Negroni, any equal parts cocktail, but as you're like trading these things out, you're actually learning more about each of them. So I think it also helps you not only in this equal parts template, but also as you move forward in your career developing cocktails in general. You're like, oh, that one time that I tried that variation, I remember that there was that vanilla note that came out of this, or, you know, there was that extra spice or bitterness that came out of that, and maybe I can bring that into this other cocktail. So I think it's a really good learning format too.
Agreed. And I think it's because it's like simple, right? You're just changing and manipulating one thing. So that when that control is there, I think that's kind of even like just the best advice of even like building drinks in general, right? You start with your one concept and then just work on changing one element until that element is where you want it. And then you start playing with the other ones, but it gives you that sort of scientific control to understand how you're shifting things. And it gives you just a better context for why you would change another part of the drink. Because to your point, if something brought more vanilla note, like, oh yeah, now do I want to amplify that or contrast against that? So maybe I need to change my base spirit and decide what I want to do with that. So I think that's a really great advice about how to use the templates. Right, so we're going to go to the next slide. And we're going to go ahead and talk about, I think Martini's next. It's my favorite. All right, Martinis. So 50-50. I mean, what a saving grace this became. We all want to be really classy and have martinis, but none of us can handle full strength. So that's good. But I think, again, to your point, Daniel, like the 50-50 really came about because we were getting better vermouths and different styles of vermouths being brought in. You know, previously they weren't being imported because the U.S., similar to kind of like sherry, they're like, yeah, they're not going to drink it. We're going to save it for Europe. And then we started being like, hey, we want this stuff too. And then we started having access to better ingredients. And this really changed a lot for me, thinking about how you build a martini and that idea of the 50-50 and how elegant and how much more the other notes of the gin would come out by using this, how you could see how whatever style of dry vermouth you used would change the whole cocktail, and that it's such a simple thing to then like confidently go in and order or make or have a big viewpoint. I'm like, I like to make my 50-50 this way and why. And I think that's always really good with equal parts drinks, is because you develop and build the why because you've experimented.
One of the things I learned from a martini was all about temperature control.
Yes.
Like there is no other city in the world like London when it comes to, you know, taking a martini tour. And if you going to have a Duke's martini, you really understand like what the temperature of your base, like your gin, is like and how it will affect it. And I got to tell you, it also helps me understand temperature of everything. It's really what will make or break the ultimate martini.
That's a really good point. And then which we kind of keep dancing around a bit, like water is obviously like one of those other ingredients that makes an equal parts drink. So, depending on if you're stirring on the rocks or stirring it up, that water is going to act differently in your cocktail. I've always been a Negroni on the rocks person. For me, I think that's the way it shines its best, but I know some people like it up. So what steps you're taking to serve it up, that you have to really make sure you're getting enough water content in there, and probably serve it in a smaller glass, like maybe this one, because I'm like, I don't want that to warm up to a point where it's just like, it just doesn't shine for me as much. But similar with my martini, I want it really, really cold. I want those ingredients in balance. But Kara found a really cool variation on this from 3 Dots and a Dash in Chicago, where they were using Clarin in a 50-50 martini. So Clarin and Cinzano Blanc vermouth, and then a dash of saline. So I was like, this is like this super cool, awesome version. I believe that's a grapefruit twist it looks like on it. But like, what a cool way to think about 50-50. Like that, my mind wouldn't have even gone to using something like this. Like I've personally never even thought of like now we can use like Sotol or some other this told me that there's so many different ways we can actually make a 50-50 that I don't think we've even scratched the surface on yet. But I thought this was a really cool thought process of how this cocktail changes a bit. Have either of you had many other 50-50 variations? I don't think.
I've had quite a few. I think we did a lot of experimentation with vermouth in the past year because we launched a vermouth to Torino. Mm-hmm. So it was a lot of making cocktails at different proportions, using different citrus twists, trying different bases, not just gin, exploring different vodkas, to do 50-50s with, because they all have their own elements that they bring to the table. And I think it's a really interesting point, because this one, the use of the Bianco vermouth is really specific, right? Because it doesn't have as much of the spice notes or the vanilla notes of a Rosso vermouth, but it does have the sweetness, which I think balances out very well with something like Claren. So I think it's a good experimentation format for what style of vermouth you're actually going to pair with whatever base that is.
Absolutely. And I like the pinch of salt there. Like, to me too, like, talks about like balancing that sweetness, to your point, and like bringing that back. So I do think that that's a really, really smart way of playing with. And then I think we can kind of top it. Well, we'll talk about it more later, but like, what if you split that blanc vermouth with dry vermouth? How is that going to change this drink? So there's lots of ways to change this. We can go to the next slide. So then things like the Adonis, like I know a lot of these cocktails, like the Adonis and Bamboo, everyone kind of has their own version of making these drinks and like ways, because like they're like, well, it depends on what kind of sherries you have or whatever, that's going to change the way you make the drink. But I like playing around with, I think the sherry cocktails in this way have the same, because you have to like identify how much oxidation you want to have in there. Are you using Fino or Manzanilla? Those have their own different things that they bring to the party, versus like Amontillado versus Oloroso. So you're playing around with these ingredients, and again, in equal parts, they'll change, and they'll change how you're, what twist you're putting on, and it'll change just a lot of different elements. But I like this in that same way, because I think there's such a giant breadth of styles and ranges of sherries that kind of are very, similar to their European counterpart to Italy, where, these fortified wines are consumed in a different way. They're with food, so there's a broad range, because the way they are, the way you drink a different sherry or a different Amari is different by what you're eating, and influenced by that. So I find when I think about food and drink cultures, that the sherry Jerez and Italy really hone those in for me. We can do the next slide. But the Bamboo has been one of the ones that has been more innovated around, and this is the Bamboo that is created by Caitlin Lehman. And Kara, this one was really specific and different because she added, one, it's a different color of a bamboo than normally we would see. Like, normally most of the bamboos I've seen always have some sort of oxidative vermouth in it. But she went with Fino, I believe, right, in this one? Mm-hmm. Let's kind of pull up that recipe again. But she definitely, like,
it was the Amontillado.
The Amontillado. So, but the color was always, but was it Amontillado and Fino stirred? Light vermouth too.
Yeah, Fino and Amontillado, a smaller portion of Amontillado.
Yeah, so not quite equal parts, but blending these together. I find that some of these drinks that were equal parts, we definitely see people veer away from it once they start equal parts, kind of like we talked about how the Negroni has a different way. But I encourage everyone to start trying to play with these in equal parts and then venture out from there. So I think you'll understand, again, what each element and ingredient is bringing to the cocktail before you do. But we will go to the next, which is getting into our shaken drinks. All right, next slide.
Lynnette, real quick, sorry, we just had a question come through, so I'll just ask it because it did pertain to sherry cocktails. Quite a few of these sherry cocktails call for orange bitters. Is there a particular brand that is better to pair with sherry? So Reagan's, Fee's, things like that.
I mean, I'm always a traditional vegan person because just, I think Angostura orange, pretty much, like, if you only have one orange, Angostura orange kind of is the closest to vegans. But Regan's has a lot more cardamom and some of the spice notes. So when I use that by itself, it's very intentional, but it mixed with these actually gives me like a nice rounded version of orange bitters. So yeah, I think just play around. And everyone's there's more bitters around. Angostura orange is probably your easiest bet for that mix, or I would mix it too in equal parts actually. That's pretty much the equal parts bitters connection.
Everything's equal parts. Doesn't even matter.
It's kind of funny.
In the bitters.
Like,
yeah.
That's all we were doing. But even so, like, I think a lot of the house vermouths, are equal parts, like Cinzano and Punta. So, that's often happening around different bars because you want a little more in your instead of having to constantly do like half, you're like, all right, it's all mixed together and this is our house vermouth. We'll go to the next slide. We're getting into shaken drinks and highballs. So highballs, I gave the Americano kind of its own little chapter because we actually, Kara and I were doing this, and the first time we did this, we didn't even include highballs in. And I think highballs are a really important space within the equal parts conversation that we don't tackle quite as often. So we'll go to the next slide. And corpse survivors. Okay, so 1, 2, and 3. This cocktail has all the different things. So if you notice, like number 1, it's not quite equal parts, but your 2 supporting characters are in equal parts for that. And then obviously the number 2, which we all know. And then the number 3, you have like the gin and Swedish punch. So it's adding a couple other different ingredients there. But the corpse survivor has its own way of being in equal parts that, like, just looking at those 3, you're like, oh, they're all corpse survivors, but completely different cocktails. Next slide. And this drink has, obviously the corpse survivor number blue. I believe that was a Jacob Breyer's cocktail, but you had things that came out. Trader Vic has even played with this, where he did 1 ounce brandy, 1 ounce Campari, 1 ounce triple sec with a ½ ounce of lemon juice. So that's where you kind of had a breakaway from this template. But you can take just the basic corpse survivor and take out gin and sub tequila or even mezcal, and like how that's going to play with the little bit of absinthe and orange. I would obviously change, if I was going to go with tequila, I'd probably change it to tequila and lime, Cointreau, Lillet, and absinthe. I could probably change my Lillet and use Koki, which is going to be a whole different thing because those aromas are different. So we'll go to the next slide, and this is kind of our like corpse survivor little do to show you how we can change all the different drinks. You can click through. Again, you change your, these are things that can be changed. So, Lillet Blanc versus Koki is going to make a difference. What kind of orange you're using. If you're going higher proof with Cointreau, or you're going to go a little lower proof and more sugar with the triple sex and curacao, and then changing your base spirit gives you like this whole range of cocktails. I think if you put like aquavit in it, you're going to get that kind of like in a little more of a tiki style with that spice. I think there's a couple of like beechwood berry drinks that really have a bit of an inspiration from the last word. There's the final ward from Phil Ward. The Ultima Palata, which is tequila. Oh My Ward, which I found, which was adding Amaro in lieu of juice and lime bitters. One of the interesting ones. And the Water Lily, which adds violet. And then it's the mezcal version. We click through here. Keep going the next slide.
Oh, nice transition.
And then the next slide again, we get to again, it's just like, these are pretty, all the last word images I found. Next one, getting to the cocktail that was on the next slide, where this was at Rick House. So they had the mariachi with mezcal, lemon, Cointreau, yellow chartreuse, and orange bitters. So changing out 2 different elements to create, a cocktail that lives within the last word, in the corpse survivor world, but yet changes a couple ingredients.
Here, Castro photobomb. I like that.
Yeah, Castro photobomb. But yeah, so let's go back one slide. I'm sorry, I kind of clicked over the last word because we did switch drinks. I'm like, wait, did we switch drinks from corpse survivor? Yes, we're into last words. So again, last words are where I finished corpse survivor, went straight into last word. But again, last word has so many different ways you can innovate around this drink. Whether you're using yellow chartreuse, green chartreuse. I like that idea of adding Amaro in there, which just brings it like into such a different realm for this cocktail. But thinking about a lot of those herbaceous, I was thinking like when I saw that, I was like, oh yeah, I guess if you really lean into like what the yellow chartreuse or the green chartreuse brings in this cocktail, if you're going to have, play around with the chartreuses, and if you're playing around with some of the Amari to have some of those herb menthol kind of aromas, you're going to kind of get a different cocktail. That would be.
It also makes me wonder to what level of bitterness of Amari you're looking for. You know what I mean? I think, especially trying to balance out sweet, you really need to find something that's a little bit higher in bitterness to fit in there.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating. I was like, wow, that's a really cool way to think about innovating this drink. But there's like just all the riffs. I think the last word. I think we've kind of had all of them, but I think I'm pushing it towards the Amaro. It just gave me a new thought process because I never really thought of playing around with that in this drink. I was like, oh wow, that's a whole new world. Next slide. We'll go 2 ahead. And then like the most famous of all the variations, the paper plane, which has been a cocktail. Like, I mean, Sam Ross, like little genius he is, has launched more modern classics than anyone I know. But what a simple, again, this is where using the Amaro in this cocktail really elevated and changed, the flavors of this drink and kind of has like created every riff. Like I actually have had on most of my menus, especially at the Llamas, some variation on a paper plane. So we opened Llama Inn with the Barracuda, which was our variation that used bourbon, Oloroso sherry, Aperol, and lemon. At Llama San, we have the Venti Uno, which goes a little bit more crazy by using a Kintaro shochu with Aperol, then using sherry, adding some sesame in there, like a little sesame cane. And so like doing something completely different and sudachi instead of regular citrus. So innovating around this template, but I always find this template is extremely, and a walnut liqueur. So we kind of make our own amari with like the sesame cane and the walnut liqueur with the sherry. And it's just been a template that I kind of like playing around with because it's such a cool drink. And for some reason, the Aperol in this drink like is always my constant because I feel like that's like to me like at least when I innovate on this drink, to me that's like what I stick with. I'm like, all right, me and the Aperol, and then I'm going to go off the paper plane from there.
And I will say, by the way, just a little historical fact here. So this is not a diss to Sam Ross, but Aperol's been around since 1919. He had a leg up not being from America because we didn't bring it to America until 2006. So I mean, he was the first one to make this drink, but it could have been us had it been around.
It's true. But he popularized it, mate. But yeah, so there you go. So I think this is just a drink that I really like playing around with, and I find that it's really food friendly. Especially like my go-to is usually mixing some sort of sherry with the Aperol, and I don't know if like for me that feels like a magic combination how those two ingredients work together. So I like playing around with that. Next slide. So then we have the Naked and Famous, which again is another famous version of this. So this is Joaquin Simo with yellow chartreuse and Aperol and mezcal, and what a delicious drink it is. I've seen this drink copied on more menus across the country without credit to Joaquin. A lot of other drinks, but the yellow chartreuse and the Aperol, like in these increments, how this drink really comes together. And I think with such a deft ability of mixing those equal parts in this drink really makes it kind of like every ingredient. I think it's elevated with this cocktail and how Joaquin kind of balanced that out. Next slide. All right, and then we found the sunflower cocktail again. I believe this is another
Sam Ross, yeah.
Sam Ross drink. Sarah, which is the sunflower one? What's his variation here?
I mean, it's a variation on the last word. It's gin, lemon, Cointreau, and elderflower liqueur.
Elderflower, yeah. So that, I mean, this was a part of the. I imagine he made this in the golden age of the Saint Germain. Anyway, all we're putting on menus, but again, such a simple variation that again, lighter, whiter, brighter, very refreshing style of drink. Next slide. And then I'm going to revisit the Americano because I think we forget about highballs, but now that like the highball is coming back as a cocktail in place of innovating, I think going back to the Americano is like this like perfect example of a nice equal parts delicious, refreshing cocktail that you can enjoy. Now, like it's a little tricky, obviously, with highballs because we're probably putting a little more of the sparkling water than equal parts, but the base of it is equal parts, and then we're lengthening all of that with the soda water. But Kara found a few really other cool variations if you want to talk about them. Like Trick Dog had one that was really cool. That I think you noted. What is it?
Yeah, they've experimented with a lot of different interesting sodas and spirits together in highball format, like Celery and Aquavit. I think another one was an apple soda called Cedra. And I forget the spirit offhand. It might have even been as simple as sherry, something like that. But the point is that they really were experimenting. I think they also had an Amaro and root beer.
Verna and root beer, I think, was there.
Yeah. And they started them as equal parts drinks, one part of each component over ice, and found that it didn't really work. And they wound up changing the ratio to 2-to-1. So 2 parts of the lengthener and 1 part of the spirit. And that was really the magic ratio for them.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point of like playing around. I think that's, I like that simplicity of starting there and then deciding which way you want to go. I think when we look at some drinks, we're always just putting a splash of soda water on it, but in these drinks, you're putting more volume for these highballs and that are inspired by the Americano. Next slide, the bicicleta, I think is another really cool one, of a cocktail where you're adding white wine to the whole equation of the Americano, which I think is really refreshing. So Campari and white wine and soda water. I'm like, nothing sounds like a suburban house party like that.
I mean, I've also found, you can use white wine, you can use dry vermouth. I've found a lot of, especially with white wines, this is one, okay, so I have to say that this is probably one of my go-to cocktails, especially in the summertime, because it is so refreshing. And you can go to almost any place that serves white wine and has Campari and be like, can I just have a glass of white wine on the rocks with a shot of Campari, top it with soda water and a lemon twist, and it's perfect. And it's one of those things. Love it. So easy to order. I do kind of feel bad sometimes because I'm kind of going off the menu, but it's great.
Do you have a particular style of white wine you like to use in this, especially with Campari? Like a more high or stay away from oaked wines, or?
I tend to do very dry. I mean, if I had my pick of the exact wine, it would either be Falangina or Vino Verde. Okay. Those are my 2 favorites, and I think with a lemon twist, it like really brings it all together. That's my favorite.
Yeah, got to work with the board of Falangina for this Italian duo. I'm like, I'm
gonna talk to somebody about that. Let me get my phone out here.
Notes like I think the first on Falangina is like banana.
Yep.
To me, that's a tropical fruit notes from that wine, and then putting Campari in it. We already know Campari and banana work, so that's like a kind of magical combination. I have to buy a bottle of Falangina and make that today. But yeah, so it's how simple like just that kind of drink can be. Next slide. And so then we any questions? So we have the equal parts within equal parts. So I think this was just kind of another thing to kind of quickly chat through. That just because you have an equal parts template doesn't mean you can't within those unequal parts have your own equal parts, and you just keep breaking equal parts all the way down. So for example, that was a perfect example, the banana Negroni. It was 1-1 and then half. So that starts giving you an opportunity to play around with split base spirits. Like what if you did 1 gin, half gin, half aquavit, 1 Campari, 1 sweet vermouth? How would that be? And then maybe change your sweet vermouth then maybe to dry vermouth. Like that would be a really cool thing. So there's so many different ways you can innovate on these cocktails by working with smaller increments then. So it's kind of like the whole math. You break it down into those simple parts to have the drinks be really cool and interesting. And I think it's a really cool way. Like I think when I'm using these kind of drinks right now, especially for anyone else who's an operator and has a bunch of you're all set up for your like spring menu launch and you're like, oh, we're summer. So, hey, I'm using a lot of this style of theory of equal parts within equal parts to put drinks on my menu and using some of the ingredients that I had that may have been a little heavier and thinking of more like transition between winter and spring. And then I can use them in smaller increments, in equal parts within equal parts drinks to kind of bring them in. So for example, the 21, the walnut liqueur could seem super wintry, but because it's split with the sesame and the, and then into the paper plane sort of model, it gets balanced out by being a small equal parts within an equal parts drink. So
we've got a couple questions that came in.
Bring on.
So first question, Lynnette, can you suggest a great 50-50 drink? Let's say besides the martini.
Besides martini, yeah. Honestly, I've been playing around a lot with, I've been keeping a ton of Blanc vermouth in my fridge and infusing it with basil. So for me, Fino sherry, equal parts Fino sherry and some sort of herb infused Blanc vermouth, stirred with a lemon twist is delicious. Even sometimes I like to do the lime peel too, depending on if I want to get like that, so a lime twist on it as well. That's been super refreshing. And then if I want to take that same drink and have it long, I'll do it equal parts into a highball.
Okay, a couple more questions. I'll put this up to both of you. How do you feel about equal parts cocktails that get unequal parted? So like,
do it. It's really broken.
I get it all the time when people are like, "Oh, well, my Negroni isn't equal parts. It's we do." I'm like, I'm not going to say you're wrong. I'm just going to say you're not as right, but it's fine.
I think there's a place for it. I mean, it's a starting point, and it's your drink, and it should be the way you like to make it, the way you like to drink it. It's a template. It's not a hard and fast rule.
Yeah, and I have to say, like, to that point though, like, Daniel, I think, I came to a lot of these cocktails because of the pedigree and where, I learned, it was like New York at that time, and here's how everyone was doing it. We all passed along, like, here's how we're doing it. Negroni has more gin in it. And then what's been refreshing is to untrain myself and go back and try it equal parts and say, oh, well, I was missing so many other things about this drink that I wouldn't have noticed if I didn't try going back to equal parts. So I believe in either way is to test yourself and test what you think you're supposed to do, and then try it some other way, because I think that's the only way we grow. And I think it's the only way we find out what we like. To your point earlier, what ingredients are really doing, and it's helped me become a better drink maker by unlearning some of the things I thought and going back to some original formulas. And then from there, I have a more informed decision on why I'm doing it another way.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Using gin, do not use more gin in your Negroni. Bad idea.
I've definitely had, and it's so subjective. Every single person, likes, like my Boulevardiers I make with rare breed. I love it. It's 160 proof. That is not something that everybody wants to drink, but I like it because it really brings out the bourbon flavor, which it's one of my favorite things. But yeah, you give it to some people, they're like,
yeah. But you're thinking about equal parts, I hope, right? You're not like,
yeah,
well, let's 1.5 that baby.
Yeah, no.
Good night.
Yeah. Several tabs. Okay, so we've got a couple more. What are some mistakes people make when making equal part cocktails? Which I don't know who asked the question, but man, if they're making mistakes, oof, okay, let's move on.
I think, well, really quickly, I think the mistakes they make is putting two things that are too similar together in the same proportion.
Yeah, I agree with that.
You know what I mean? Like, so you're trying to be all clever and creative, and then, like, this is the classic thing where someone took an ounce of Angostura, threw it with an ounce of Campari and an ounce of gin, and you're like, oh, there's no balance. What happened?
Yeah. Yeah, it's all about balance, right? I mean, equal parts of 3 types of gin is, I don't know. I mean, that's a really intense martini, but.
I think the mistake people often make is assuming that it's going to always work. It doesn't always work. It can be too heavy-handed, especially if you have an ingredient that's just way too dominant. It just overpowers everything, and it really ought to be a much smaller proportion. You need to recognize that and say, well, this is not an equal parts drink. It's not going to work out.
And that's where maybe equal parts within equal parts will save you, because you can come down and balance that bear when working with it. Like,
yeah, I think that's a good.
For example, like if someone put an ounce of banana liqueur in a Negroni variation for me, I'd be like,
Another question came through. is a non-alcoholic equal parts cocktail possible? And this is where I would say, I don't know if you've ever done suicide when you were a kid, when you go through the soda fountain and try every single type. I mean, that was delicious. That's my only input. I'll let you go from there.
Yeah, I mean, why not? I think, obviously the world of non-alc products are better out there. So I think we're getting things that we can do with more range of flavor. And like, man, I'm a sucker for a spindrift. Like, grab a spindrift and throw like, a non-alcoholic distillate in there. You're going to be like super happy.
The Italian sodas right now are so amazing. I think that would be a really fun place to start. I mean, if you can't have your Campari, maybe you could have Stoppi and sort of back your way into a Negroni-esque creation somehow.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, there's definitely ways of finding bitter elements that are non-alcoholic, just because so many of the things that we think of that are bitter are made with alcohol doesn't mean that some of them can't be made without. And I don't even think you need distillation in general. I think just, the extraction through maceration of some sort of bitter botanical can be done with a solvent like water. Yeah. So there's definitely things out there.
Things like birch, for me, kind of bring in a lot of what I find you get in Amaro. So like, I feel like some of those flavor nuances you can get through, and then I do think there's a way. I mean, that's a really cool concept. I'm like, I can't wait to check out what you do with equal parts non-alcs, but I think it's a cool space to play around in.
Yeah, I agree. That was the last question. If we want to finish up this one. Yeah.
Cool. Anyone else in this group have any questions? What are you going to make yourself today? I'm going to for me.
Lynnette, what are you drinking?
It's the Negroni. I'm like, I was missing. Well, it's National Rum Month, and I was missing my Appleton.
Oh, nice.
Okay, so I'm like, well, I did plenty of. It's the Negroni has been the cocktail I've trained my COVID quarantine partner at making for me. So I'll be like, I have to finish the Zoom, but I have to get dinner ready, so I better have a Negroni stat. So I'm going to enjoy kind of owing this month to my Kingston Negronis. So the National Rum Month, that's going to be my variation, and I'm excited to think about what I want to do for Negroni Week. Now you have my brain spinning and what we can do to help and support, and for everyone out there, I hope if you're quarantined someplace with lots of random spirits you haven't played around with a while, start equal parts and go. Let's see what's going on.
I love that. That's a great idea.
And thanks to both of you for doing this with me today. This has been really awesome and fun. And keep creating, everyone. Have fun. And let's keep innovating and thinking and going back to school, because like, just again, revisiting equal parts drinks and classics in that form has been really mind opening for me, and giving me like ways to think creatively about innovating. So,
Carol, would you just put the book up so everybody can see it? So if they want to grab a copy, they know exactly what it looks like.
Here it is. Shakespeare.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much for doing that. Ladies, thank you so much for taking the time and sitting through this today. This is great. I learned a lot. I'm definitely going to go make some equal parts cocktails later. So I appreciate it.
All right, cool. All right, thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks for the cocktail week.